This is the second lecture in the Phil200 program. What we are going to do this evening is to look at the origins of philosophy in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, the ancient Greeks are the people who really invented philosophy. Now, I could start on a sort of negative note because it may be a theory that you may have heard espoused by a number of so-called Africanist thinkers or pseudo-Africanist thinkers. And that is that the Greeks stole philosophy from Black people, from ancient Egypt. Now, the Greeks learned a lot from the ancient Egyptians, and they credited the ancient Egyptians, right, as the people who, to a large extent, contributed to the general growth of Mediterranean civilization from which they benefited. At one time, Herodotus, the father of history, was writing in the 6th century, around the time of Ezekiel and these people. Herodotus said everything the Greeks knew, they learned from the Egyptians. But in terms of philosophy, that's different. They got a lot of technology and so on from the Egyptians, but they certainly did not get philosophy from the Egyptians. They invented this philosophy spontaneously and creatively. And once you begin to study Greek philosophy, you recognize that Greek philosophy is really a conversation between Greeks. And we are going to begin the conversation this evening that they started among themselves. Greece is an amazing country, and the Greek civilization of ancient times, the 4th, the 5th, the 3rd century BC, even up to the time of the Roman conquests and the establishment of the Roman Empire, Greek civilization was a remarkable civilization. In fact, when you look at what was happening in 4th century Greece and 3rd century Greece, I do not think outside of modernity we can conceptualize a civilization that was as vibrant, as intelligent, as progressive as the civilization of the ancient Greeks. Clearly, there were negative features. There were qualities of ancient Greek civilization that we would not want to appropriate and we would not want to admire. But when it comes to the development of philosophical ideas, the ancient Greeks stood out among all ancient peoples. And to a large extent, even up to the present time, it is ancient Greek philosophy that continues to dominate our own philosophical thinking up to the 21st century. The views of the ancient Greek thinkers like Plato and Aristotle are still discussed in great detail. And in fact, a number of contemporary modern writers have said that all of Western philosophy are merely footnotes to Plato, who many regarded as the greatest philosopher who ever lived. Now, Greece is really a small peninsula in the northeastern Mediterranean, Aegean area. And it includes a number of islands. So there's a great similarity between ancient Greeks and perhaps modern Caribbean peoples. A number of very small islands. These islands are now tremendous tourist attractions in the 21st century. And it also extended to Asia Minor, what is now today Turkey. In fact, the first Greek thinkers would have emerged in that area. But later on, the center of intellectual discussion, the center of intellectual research and so on, really found its place in Athens, one of the major Greek cities. Athens is now the capital of Greece, but at that time it was merely a city-state. Greek civilization was a civilization of city-states, right? There was Athens on the one hand, there was Sparta, there was Corinth, there was Ephesus. All of these were Greek city-states, Thebes and so on. And there were interesting relations between them. They communicated with each other. In fact, one of the beautiful things about the ancient Greeks is that they invented the Olympic Games every 4 years. They had other kinds of games, but the Olympic Games stood out every 4 years, where all these Greek cities came together, send their athletes and their artists, because Olympics in ancient Greece was not just a question of running and jumping and skipping and so on. It really was a competition between all creative peoples in what we now call sports, as well as in the areas of drama and poetry and so on. And so there was always that kind of interaction between the Greeks. The city-states traded among each other, but they also fought among each other. There was the famous Peloponnesian War, where the city-states divided into two factions, one led by Athens on the one hand, and the other led by Sparta on the other. So they fought among themselves, and they played among themselves, and they worked among themselves. One of the interesting features of the ancient Greeks is that they were seamen, and that gave them a specific kind of advantage in the area of knowledge and science and cultural exposure. Because since they were always traveling between Egypt on the one hand and the Tigris-Euphrates Valley on the other, and they were exploring all quarters of the Mediterranean, traveling from here to there, very often traveling up to places as far as Thrace, which is now considered to be Russia, or part southern Russia. And so the Greeks were picking up a lot of information and knowledge from everyone. And it is that conglomeration of ideas, that capacity to learn, to gain exposure from so many various cultural sources, that I think gave the Greeks that special advantage over everyone in terms of developing the sciences and the philosophies to a point where Egyptians and Mesopotamians had not yet reached. One of the things about Greek philosophy is that it implies freedom of thought, freedom of ideas. And the beautiful thing about the Greeks was that there are two interesting things about the Greeks. First of all, Greek religion was a religion that was filled with all kinds of mythological stories. Stories of the gods, stories of Zeus, stories of all the gods and goddesses and their interactions and their seductions and their marriages and their rivalries and so on. And by the 4th century, Greeks were no longer able to subscribe to those views. Those ideas seem to be very far-fetched and banal. And in fact, a number of the early Greek thinkers looked down on those stories, those mythological stories. In addition to that, the priesthood among the Greeks never assumed the kind of strength and authority that it had, say, among the Hebrews or the Egyptians or the Sumerians or the Assyrians and so on. It never had that kind of hold. You had Greek sibyls with their temples here and there. They had all kinds of rites, religious rites and ceremonies, very similar to the rites of ceremonies of all Mediterranean peoples. Slaughtering of bullocks, and the burning of the flesh to their gods and so on. The sibyls very often were consulted if kings or generals wanted to know what the outcome of a particular war would be. And they went to these sibyls and they received, the oracles. Very many of the oracles were couched in a very paradoxical way. So whatever the outcome of the war, the oracles would certainly still not be incorrect. So there was an increasing disbelief with respect to their religion. And that is why the Greeks were able to break the stranglehold of the priesthood and of dogmatic theology, and they were able to think freely without any fear of persecution. Because one of the problems with dogmatic theology of the priesthood is that if you go against it, then you're risking your life. You can be executed, stoned in ancient Israel, crucified in some parts of the world, and so on. With the Greeks, they had no such fears. They could think whatever they wanted and say whatever they wanted. And so to a large extent, what was happening in ancient Greece was that you had that very, very healthy kind of philosophical discussion taking place. The atmosphere was created for that. The conditions were created for that. And so Greek philosophy was born. But before the rise of Greek philosophy, Greek literature had assumed a tremendous ascendancy, right? The Greeks, like the Hebrews, had books that everybody read. Those were books that were used to educate the people. They depended on them for knowledge, for learning. They depended on them and their stories in such a way as to work out the best forms of human relationships and the best values by which they should live. And there are two books written by the famous poet Homer. Homer is called the father of poetry. There are two books written by Homer, the Iliad, which recounts the story of the fall of Troy, and the Odyssey, which is a narrative of the journey of Ulysses, who was one of the men, or Odysseus is another name that he's called by, who was one of the men who left the Trojan War and took 10 years to return home, and that is 10 years from Asia Minor to Greece, and Asia Minor is just next door to Greece, so he had a number of adventures. These are two books that really nurtured the minds and the sensibilities of ancient Greeks. They studied it, and out of those books, there are certain kinds of values that emerge and came to characterize the Greek people as a nation. Now, they are not different from that of many other nations fundamentally. When you read these celebrated stories of the famous exploits of Homer, sorry, not of Homer, of Achilles in the Trojan War, and of Archimedes in the Trojan War and so on, you recognize that there are certain outstanding character qualities, right, that define these individuals. And those are some of the qualities that the Greeks try themselves as a people to appropriate. There's this celebration of excellence. They celebrated excellence in whatever they did. The heroic values of ancient societies. And again, we can draw correspondences with the Hebrews. When you look at Hebrew culture in the pre-exilic period, those were the same kinds of values that they cherished, right? David is a hero in ancient Hebrew culture and Hebrew tradition because he was a great soldier. He was able to not only conquer the Philistines, he was able to win Jerusalem as a city, establish it as the capital of his kingdom, and be able to achieve a tremendous amount of economic prosperity and military success. That was characteristic of almost all the Mediterranean civilizations, and certainly characteristic of the Greeks. And they saw that exemplified in the story of the Iliad. And there's another interesting value that was very present among the ancient Greeks, and again, characteristic of all Mediterranean civilizations. You would find it also in the early biblical writings, and that is the fear of hubris, H-U-B-R-I-S or H-Y-B-R-I-S. Hubris really refers to, when you talk about the fear of hubris, ancient people were very, very careful not to compete with the gods and not to challenge the gods. And that implied that human life had to be a life of restraint and a life of temperance, that pride was a danger, and that once you became overweening in your pride, then you would suffer a tremendous fall. There was a fear of angering the gods. And it's a similar concept that you get, for example, in the first few chapters of Genesis, right? When you read about the Genesis story, right? Adam and Eve are told not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent tells them that if they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they will become like God, knowing good and evil. They eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God has to come down and stop them, because Elohim announced that this was a dangerous step they had taken, because now they have become like one of us, knowing good and evil, and therefore we have to take the tree of life away from them. Now that That story gives you a very good idea as to what the Greeks meant by hubris. You do not challenge the gods. You do not try to become like them, right? You have to maintain that fundamental distinction between humanity and divinity. Humanity's responsibility is to achieve excellence as human beings, but to establish limits and restraints so that you will not challenge the gods and therefore offend them, an act that would lead to human destruction. So the pre-Socratic philosophers were fed on these ideas. The place where the first recognized philosopher emerged was in the island of Miletus, which is outside of the Greek mainland. And in fact, it's much nearer to Asia Minor. And that early philosopher, his name was Thales, Thales. And Thales came up with a very mind-boggling idea. You would even say it's a harebrained idea. And he says, everything comes from water. And that's an interesting notion. Everything comes from water. Now, clearly, when we look at the evidences around, that cannot be so. That is not so. We know that there are solid objects in the world. We know that there are gases existing. We know that there are liquids of one type or another. Water is a liquid. But in Thales' mind, what is interesting and unique about water is that it can take a solid form like the earth, become an ice, or it can take a gaseous form, melt, and become vapor. So these three phases of water suggest that water may be the substance that embraces the totality of the material physical world. Because when you look at the material physical world, there are these three kinds of substances: solids, liquids, and gases. And therefore, there must be something underlying the material world which can take these various forms under changing conditions. And so Thales came up with the notion that there is ultimately within the many, all the things in the world, the many he called it, there must be a fundamental and underlying oneness. That oneness will be a oneness that we could detect at the very the most fundamental material level, and that would have to be either water or something very watery. Now he was followed by another Greek thinker, Anaximander. And Anaximander also was based in Miletus. Anaximander disagreed with him. Anaximander argued that the underlying substance cannot be water. Whatever that underlying substance is, what he called the earth stuff, right? That underlying substance must be something more fundamental than water. It is not something that we can perceive immediately, because everything in the world will comprise of it. And since there's so many different things in the world, that ultimate stuff would be different at its very foundational level from all of the other stuffs, all of the other materials that we find in the world, right? So he believed that there was a primordial substance underlying everything, but it could not be water. Anaximander had some very interesting notions in addition to that. He had a theory of evolution. He believed that all life came from the sea. So there's still this predominance of water in everything, right? He believed that lives come from the sea and that things evolved by adaptation to the environment. Now, this is an idea that was never accepted by any of the ancients as far as I can remember, but re-emerged in the 19th century with Charles Darwin as the famous evolutionary theory. He believed that man descended from animals, right? And the cosmos is governed by a war of opposites. So Anaximander had some very interesting ideas, and ideas that did not gain a hold on the ancient Greek imagination for hundreds of years or thousands of years, but eventually re-emerged and has now become one of the dominant theoretical positions of the contemporary sciences. And then there's Anaximenes, right, who argued that no, that ultimate substance is air. And what happens with air is that there are different degrees of rarefication, so it becomes thinner and thinner, or condensation, where it could either become a liquid or it could become a solid. But if you look at air, its all pervasiveness and so on, then you recognize that air must be that primordial substance. Objects emerge through condensation and rarefication, right? And it's an interesting notion because he says quantity determines quality. That's a very, very contemporary modern notion, a very materialistic kind of idea too. Very often we see quantities and qualities as separate and distinct phenomena. When you talk about quality, you're talking about how good something is, how beautiful it is, how tasty it is, and so on. Quantity is how much it is. You talk about quantity, you're talking about numerical differences. He is saying that numerical differences are the bottom of qualitative differences. Quantity is at the foundation of quality. And that is a notion that has returned in modern times, very much characteristic of contemporary materialism. He believed that the earth was flat and that the earth floats in the air. The next great thinker lived in Samos, right? And that is an island south of Sicily, but it's a Greek colony. It was a Greek colony. And his name is Pythagoras, and it's a name that is still very familiar to all of us. I remember when I in my secondary school was exposed to the theorem of Pythagoras. Pythagoras' famous theorem about the hypotenuse in relation to the other two sides. The angle of the hypotenuse is sum of the angle on the other two sides. Fascinating theorem. Right? Pythagoras of Samos was also one of the great ancient philosophers and had a powerful effect on Greek philosophy later on, and is still considered, even up to the present time, to be one of the foundational philosophers. Because what he did is that he put mathematics at the center, right, of the universe. Mathematics explained everything as far as he was concerned. In fact, he said God is a mathematician. He is a geometer. He has put the world together through subtle mathematical principles. And the greatest religious task of the individual is to try to understand those principles by studying mathematics. So mathematics in the Pythagorean system becomes actually a religious duty. And he had a famous cult. His cult would practice things like vegetarianism and so on. He believed in the immortality of the soul and the transmigration of souls. That notion of the transmigration of souls is also a very interesting notion, that a soul can leave one body and go into another body. The first people who would have had such a concept would have been the Hindus in India, notion of the transmigration of souls. And it is believed that Pythagoras may have been influenced by Indian philosophy or Indian metaphysics, and so came up with that notion. But that notion of the transmigration of souls, that a soul doesn't remain just in one body, but can transmigrate to another body. In fact, in the Hindu system, as well as the Pythagorean, it could become animal, it could become insect, it could become any other form of life, right? That is a notion that was espoused by Pythagoras, and a notion that has survived through the centuries, right? But his really important contribution was his identification of mathematics as revelatory of the mind of God and as fundamental to an understanding of the nature of being. Today we have people who are neo-Pythagoreans. Some of the greatest philosophers today have gone right back to Pythagoras, making mathematics foundational in our understanding of ontology. Pythagoras had also one other interesting ideas. He believed the earth was a sphere, right? One of the first men to believe the earth was a sphere. And he came up with that notion in a very interesting manner. He says, when you look at it, an eclipse, it's always wrong. Now, if the earth was like a coin, then from the various angles that we see the eclipses, the form would have changed. It would have been a circle at one time. It would have been a line at another time. It would have been somewhere between a line and a circle at another time. But he said it's always wrong. From whatever angle we get that eclipse. So the earth has to be a sphere. Now that's a remarkable discovery because it is based on close observation of things in the natural world and ultimately a theorization of that, coming up with a conclusion which we know today has been the correct conclusion. In those days, the notion of the earth being a sphere was merely theoretical. Nobody had yet proved it. We had to wait on Columbus and others to prove that. But here, he is working it out by simple observation. He discovered the numerical intervals in music, right? That when you look at the difference between the scales and so on, those differences can be defined numerically. Harmony, therefore, is a numerical ratio and governs music. And he also believed that not only does it govern the music that we play in instruments or the music that we produce with our voices, but it also governs the music of the spheres. And the music of the spheres, it's supposed to be the music that emerges, which we can't hear, but it's there, that emerges from the heavenly bodies as they are moving around the earth from day to day. So the earth is spherical and is not the center of the universe. These are views of Pythagoras. And then there's Heraclitus of Ephesus. Heraclitus of Ephesus came up with a very interesting notion. He says, no one ever steps in the same river twice. Whenever you go into that river, you may think that its location is the same, but the water is always different. And so he sees all of reality as change, as flux, as motion, as whirl, W-H-I-R-L. No one steps in the same river twice. Strife or the war of opposites governs the cosmos and is essential to the being that underlies the universe. But that's also a very, very striking notion. And we're going to see that it's going to return in philosophical discussion in modern times. The notion that everything that happens in the world is really evidence of change. Nothing remains static. Everything changes, right? The world is essentially a world in which we are seeing, you know, the radical changing of the nature of things. He was pantheistic in his belief, and he believed that there still is a kind of primordial substance somewhere underlying everything, and that substance is fire. And he came up with a very interesting notion that ultimately the world will be destroyed by fire. That became a fundamental concept in Stoicism. The response to Heraclitus was a very interesting one by Parmenides, because Parmenides believed that nothing changes. Very often in our religious discourses, we talk about a God who does not change. God does not change. Parmenides is saying being is one, and it's really motionless. God, he identifies God with being, and it cannot change, right? He says that the change or becoming is merely an illusion, that we think we are seeing change taking place around us. But in truth and in fact, nothing changes. What is substantial remains what it is. That's a monistic kind of materialism, a materialism, right, that believes that becoming is really illusory, and fundamental to the nature of reality is the fact that nothing changes. Parmenides had a very powerful influence later on, and when we come to Plato, you will see how very important both Heraclitus and Parmenides were, because both of them are expressing radically different ontologies. One says that everything changes, the other says that nothing changes. And one of the great achievements of Plato is to pull them both together, to synthesize them, and to create a new metaphysics, which becomes dominant for the next 2,000 years. So I made that point. We will come to Plato later on, but I made that point for you to recognize the very important role that these early thinkers played in the shaping of Greek thought and the establishing of the fundamentals of philosophical discussion. And then there's Zeno of Elea. Zeno came up with the notion of the dialectic, again, the notion of conflict. He took it from Pythagoras, right? That the essential, and Heraclitus, that essentially the universe is one in which there is continuous conflict, right? And that conflict is something that we are seeing in the way in which the forces of nature operate, in the way in which human society operates. Zeno came up with a number of interesting paradoxes to prove, right, that motion is virtually an illogical kind of thing, that you can't logically conceptualize motion. Because how could, if motion is taking place, it means that things are simultaneously in one spot and not in that spot, but in another spot. Very interesting notion. And therefore he came up with a number of riddles, if you wish, right, or paradoxes that attempted to define through thought the logical impossibility of many things that you take as actualities in the real world. And then there's Empedocles of Sicily. And Empedocles was a very interesting person. He expounded the notion of the four elements. Most of the earlier thinkers were really looking for a single underlying primordial substance that explains everything. But Empedocles said, why do you have to do that? There are four basic elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And in fact, that became the dominant philosophy because it was eventually accepted by Aristotle, who gave the world a world picture. He gave Western society a world picture that survived up to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. And for a long time, people accepted that there are four elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And I remember when I was in primary school, that's what they taught me, that there are four elements: fire, water, air, and earth. I mean, those of you who are good chemistry students will know that there are over 100 elements now. And that fire, water, air, and earth are really very often compounds of those fundamental elements. But that is one of the main contributions that Empedocles made. Empedocles was a very interesting character, and it is said that he eventually climbed to the top of Mount Etna, which is an active volcano, and dived into Etna, either to become a god or to return to God. Because remember, in ancient times, volcanoes were always associated with the Godhead, right? You always expected with the noise and the terror and the earthquakes and so on. It was always felt that powerful forces inhabit those spaces, such as volcanoes. The children of Israel, for example, got the law of Moses from when he went up into the volcano and came back with the 10 Commandments. Volcanoes have always played that important role in ancient time. And Empedocles decided to dive into Etna, down into the heart of the volcano, either to become a god, they said, or return to God, from which he believed he came. And then there's Anaxagoras. He was a Parmenian. He accepted that nothing in the world changes, but he came up with another notion, and the notion of the concept of mind, the principle of the nous, right? Now that became very, very important in later philosophy, right? That when you look at all of the stuff of the universe, the material stuff of the universe, behind all of this, you can see the evidence of a mind present in all living things, setting all things in order, right? Providing the universe with a certain kind of structure that eventually developed into the logos, a logos metaphysics, a belief that ultimately behind everything is mind. Now that is a very, very much a pantheistic kind of notion, because here you are seeing in the material universe the capacity for thought and order and logic and so on. But it was a very important notion that came eventually to invade Christianity later on in the early Christian period, during the medieval period and so on. Those ideas now began to infiltrate into Christianity. And then there was Democritus, together with people like Eusebius. And Democritus's argument was that ultimately the universe consists of very minute particles. Again, he was dismissed. Aristotle and others had dismissed him. But it is his view that is now the dominant view in the world. Right? He called them atoms. He says that if you take any substance and you divide it up, right, almost infinitesimally, you're going to arrive at a point where you can no longer divide. And that point that you arrive at gives you an insight into the ultimate constituents of the universe. The universe is comprised of atoms. The atoms themselves cannot be split, but they are the fundamental ingredients of the universe. Later on in the Renaissance period, when people reverted back to the atomic theory, for example, Isaac Newton was an atomist, right? When they reverted back to the atomic theory, again, that view was articulated that the atom cannot be split. The atom is the ultimate constituent of the universe. And the man who ultimately was able to dismiss that was Albert Einstein, when he came up with his famous equation, E equal mc squared, which is an equation that suggested that you could split the atom and convert it into energy, because ultimately energy and mass are equivalent. You know, in pre-Einsteinian physics, energy and mass were not the same, they were opposites. But he came up with the conclusion that energy and mass are equivalent. Now that is an account of these early famous Greek philosophers. And there are a number of things about them which are very significant. First of all, they are all preoccupied with ontology. They want to understand essentially what is the nature of being, what is being, what does being consist of. Now, nobody in ancient times elsewhere, as far as I know, had that concern. You know, there are always theories of creation in all cultures. And very often in the theories of creation, water may have played a great part, earth would have played a very great part. Very often God was seen as a designer who, out of the water, collected the earth and fashioned things into being. But the human mind did not attempt to go beyond that. What the Greeks are doing is going to the very foundation of the material world itself to understand what is the nature of what constitutes reality. Now, what they were doing in ancient times, in that ancient period, is very similar to what modern physicists are doing now. If you look at modern cosmology and modern physics, what you recognize is that a lot of modern cosmology and modern physics is the search for what is ultimate in the physical world. With Einsteinian theory, the atom itself has been split. But physicists are finding in these great giant accelerators like CERN in Switzerland and so on, they are discovering that there are a host of subatomic particles that emerge from an atom when it's split. And more, that confusion of these many particles compels them to move beyond that, to still find an ultimate constituent of the natural world. They are looking for what is called a grand unified theory of everything, or right, a theory of everything, or a grand unified theory. They are referred to as GUTS, grand unified theory, or TOEs, theory of everything. And these theories are theories that aim to find the ultimate constituent of everything. And one of the most famous theories, which seems to be providing a solution to that, is what is called superstring theory. That at the end of everything, when you look at the particles that exist in their great variety, they all really are a small filament of energy. Now, why have I taken you there into some of the complexities of modern physics? Because actually, the great achievements of modern physics can be traced right back to those early Greek thinkers, those early ontologists who were struggling with the same kinds of intellectual challenges, but who did not have the technologies, did not have the mathematical competence to resolve those problems. But it started there. And it's one of the reasons why last time we talked, I mentioned that a number of modern philosophers are no longer concerned with content in philosophy. They are much more concerned with method. A lot of contemporary philosophy has left content, has left method, has left the ontological quest to the physicists, right? The nuclear physicists and the particle physicists and the cosmologists and so on. Let them tell us what the ultimate constituent of matter is. But this is something that began in philosophical speculation. It did not begin, right? And it did not begin as a scientific enterprise. The ancients did not have the competence and the equipment for a scientific enterprise. In fact, when you look at the ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, and they all called pre-Socratics, the pre-Socratic philosophers because they were before Socrates, when you look at them, you see that there is a fusion of philosophical concern and scientific interest. The two things are not yet separate. They have not gone apart, right? They are still one and the same. The search for the ultimate constituents of the universe is both a scientific enterprise as well as a philosophical enterprise. For them, it could be nothing else than a philosophical enterprise because all they had were the intellectual resources that God had given them. So those early Greek philosophers, right, laid the foundation for the rise of Western science, for the rise of Western philosophy, for the rise of Western knowledge and its expansion into so many other areas, and they are extremely important. Right? Later on, in the next topic that we are coming into, we'll see that the philosophical interest shifted significantly from what the universe was comprised of, ontological issues, to very existential issues, issues concerning man. After a time, people became so confused with the various theories and notions that people were beginning to question, why are we wasting our time with this? There are so many possible theories and everybody's come up with a different theory. Why can't we concentrate our intellectual inquiry on an area that is of far greater significance? And that's the area of human life, human being, human society, the human mind. And so when we come to the next lecture, we are going to be exploring that new dimension of philosophical inquiry. Again, a tremendous contribution of the ancient Greeks, and one that laid the foundations for the thought of Western civilization.